Good morning. Welcome back. Let's see. All right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. I believe it's correct to say that I'm one of the few people who's focusing entirely on research environments where the research actually occurs. And just so you know where we're going, I have 3 recommendations I'll be ending with. One of them is that we should be assessing and benchmarking our institutional environments where the research occurs. The second one is that we have to do a dramatically better job with responsible conduct of research education, research ethics education. And the third is to improve institutional stewardship. And institutional stewardship should be improved both by assessing and benchmarking our environments, by dramatically better RCR, and through some other mechanisms I'd like to talk a little bit about putting some issues on the table. I'm going to make my argument in 4 pieces. I want to start by drawing back and thinking about a longer view. I want to focus on the fact that people are complicated and context really matters in terms of how these things work. And I'd like to focus on the institutional research environments and how they can either be part of the problem or part of the solution and move us more towards institutional environments, really improving the matter rather than undercutting it. I should say, as a matter of disclosure and background, my perspectives grows out of a career dealing with problems in research universities. So I spent almost 10 years as a research integrity officer, receiving allegations and conducting investigations. I've been on the workplace violence team. I've been the coordinator for the campus grievance system. I provided oversight for the campus grievance system for discrimination and harassment. I've done work in bully-proofing academic units. I do a lot of work with dysfunctional academic units these days. It's a bigger and bigger problem in some places. I have presided over degree revocation proceedings. I've done a number of internal investigations, both in research and financial, for people involved in research. I was briefly the executive secretary of our IRB after a breach. So I've spent a lot of time looking and dealing with the aftermath of problems of highly educated, highly credentialed, very smart people in research universities. And I'm more and more interested in prevention because although there's a certain amount of adrenaline that goes with dealing with the problems, I always tell people I come from the train wreck school of professional ethics. There's also a predictable pattern to it, and what you find over time is that the kinds of ways that people go wrong in our settings tend to recur. And if we can put our energy into prevention, we can spend much more of the time and energy in our life force on the things that brought us into higher education and academia in the first place. And so that's what I'm interested in, is how do we prevent these problems? So I'd like to start with my first point about the longer view, is that we've been talking about many of these elements for a long time, because fundamentally we're talking about research integrity and rigor in research. I think the part of the narrative and the discussion that we've been having that's new, the newest part, is the part that Victoria Stodden brings in talking about computational reproducibility, simply because the technology and the manner of research has changed over time. Other elements, though, about how do we assure the rigor of research have been present in the internal community discussions for a long time. There is, in fact, an almost direct straight line from John Baylor's comments in 1986 about science, statistics, and deception. He was at one time the statistics editor for the New England Journal of Medicine. Almost a direct straight line from the points that John made in 1986 to the ones that Paul Friedman made in 1996 about research activities in which practical problems arise. Paul Friedman was in cardiology at UCSD, and he was responsible for the investigation into the unfortunate fabrications by a cardiology fellow that found that at least 99 papers were not valid. And they rigorously examined every single paper this cardiology fellow had ever been involved in. And that was more than 100 papers, 147, I think, as I recall. And so if you look at those items that Paul talked about in his article, you find, again, almost a direct straight line to the things that Begley talked about in 2013 when they couldn't replicate studies. So these issues are not new. The issues of how hard it is to achieve rigor in research are not new. Unfortunately, some of my message is not particularly new because the things that I'm talking about where the ethical conduct of research is central to universities because it's where research and graduate education occur, and the responsibility for ethical conduct is an individual one and it's a community one. And it goes all the way from top to bottom and bottom to top. Paul Friedman in 1999 observed that one must not ignore another important influence on research integrity, the research environment. Unfortunately, the momentum is in the opposite direction. The problems are not new. The fact that we are trying to be better and do better, because we are better than this, is not new. And so the question is that we're asking, and in this symposium and in other places in the community, are really important questions. Why is so much work not reproducible? And what systems can we put in place to improve reproducibility? These are really important questions. My plea is simply that we ask some additional questions. And the additional questions I think we need to ask include, what do we know, what have we learned about cognition and decision making that contribute to these problems? And more particularly, how can we use what we have learned from advances in understanding and from experience to reinforce research integrity? And that's really where I come from in all of this. So there are three things that I'd like to focus on in the people are complicated part of my argument. One is what we have come to know about cognitive biases and how they affect and infect human decision making. In that, I'd like particularly to focus on loss aversion and how powerfully that plays into things that happen. And I'd like just to highlight something that I talk a lot about with emerging professionals, which is what I call career tragedies. Tragedies is an acronym, and it stands for temptation, rationalization, ambition, group and authority pressure, entitlement, deception, incrementalism, embarrassment, and stupid systems. Because in pretty much every problem that occurs, most of them preventable, if we were training people to recognize and understand how it feels to be falling into some of the career tragedies, I'm tempted and then I can rationalize it, and then my ambition is driving me not to do something about it, and the dangers of incrementally softening your standards or taking a little step over the line. These things lead people into preventable problems. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk enough about how it feels to feel stupid when you're doing research because you're asking a question that hasn't been answered before. Now, Joshua Lederberg, a great man, wrote in 1995 about sloppy research and it extracting a greater toll. And I think that he recognized many of the points that some of the social psychology about cognitive biases and cognitive errors and decision making have reinforced. He talked about the fact that we are all humans and we're not equally well trained to avoid even simple logical and statistical fallacies. He talked about entering into a cognitive network of great complexity and the loss of efficiency in experimental design, in self-delusion, and in confused reporting. Richard Feynman, of course, recognized this, and one of our questioners referred to Richard Feynman earlier. You're the easiest person to fool, so you have to be very careful about that. After you've not fooled yourself, it's easy not to fool other scientists. We have to train ourselves and train our students to recognize what self-deception feels like. And even Feynman's observation was not particularly new, since Demosthenes observed in the 3rd century BC that nothing is easier than self-deceit. And we don't talk enough about how easy it is to fall into these traps. So I want to emphasize that I don't think that the problems are all from bad or careless people. In fact, I think exactly the contrary. I have dealt with far too many earnest, well-meaning, smart people who ended up in trouble because of things they didn't know they didn't know. And that's really what I want to focus on. Victoria, I think, mentioned and described in her opening remarks on the first day this lovely paper about the devil in the details in the FACS study. These were really smart, well-intentioned people who were trying hard to collaborate, and they found out that it's really hard. Collaboration is hard. There are a lot of stories in science about people trying to collaborate, trying to do the same work, and finding that mind reading is a very imperfect form of communication, as it turns out. There are lots of things that we don't adequately communicate with each other. And so there are things about collaboration and communication with other human beings that are just complicated. And we're doing very complicated things. Absolutely, there are bad apples. There are some probably irreducible number of truly bad, horrible, evil people. They exist. And No matter how much I talk about the environment, I try to stress, and I think it's important to acknowledge, we are individually, each of us, always, always, always responsible for our own conduct. Always. When I talk about environment, one of the first things that people tell me is, well, so are you trying to say that it's the environment's fault? And I generally respond by saying, I am the mother of children. When my oldest daughter, who's going to be an assistant professor in the fall now, so she's growing up, when she was 3 and came home and said, well, yeah, I broke the rule, but Benji made me do it, my response then was, and who's responsible for your choices, you or Benji? Well, I guess me. And what I say to people is, you can bet that if I'm going to hold a 3-year-old responsible for actions, I really believe that somebody with a PhD is responsible for his or her actions too. And so we are responsible for our actions, and the problem in our community that concerns me, that I would like to see us do better about, is that we are way too fond of the bad apple narrative. And I will come back to that later, because the barrel shapes perceptions and choices, and we don't talk enough about the environment or think enough about it or work hard on fixing the parts of it that we can fix. Jim Lang did a roundup in his book, Cheating Lessons, which is a lovely book on undergraduate cheating. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And one of the things that he did when he rounded up the research is that he found that there are 5 factors that influence whether undergraduates will cheat. And it has to do about, is there an emphasis on performance as opposed to mastery? Is it high stakes versus frequent low stakes assessment? Extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation? Is the student trying to get the A because their parents want them to succeed, or are they trying to do it because they're intrinsically motivated and curious? Low expectation of success versus there is a path to success, and a peer culture that accepts or disapproves. If you notice the factors that increase cheating, emphasis on performance, very high stakes, low expectation of success, those are prevalent in the kind of big stakes science that happens in research universities. In Lang's research and his summary of the work in this area, he points out that the single most strongest indicator of whether a student will cheat or not is whether there's a peer culture that accepts or disapproves of the conduct. So a student who comes out of an exam and says, I had the answers on my calculator, and has a colleague who says, ooh, cool, is much more likely to engage in cheating than one who comes out and says, oh, I had all the answers on my calculator, and somebody says, ooh, I like to do the work myself. So the peer culture is heavily determinative. I spend an unfortunate amount of time, I don't know if it's unfortunate, I spend a fair amount of time being invited for an invitation that reads like this. We need an ethical event next semester. Could you come? We've heard you can do that. And so I show up to be the ethical event of the semester, and I always ask to speak to the graduate students alone, and I ask them, what's it like to do research here? What's it like in your lab? What kind of pressures do you face? How is it? And I hear things that are kind of unfortunate across the board about what the culture does and doesn't accept and what the students are learning. So we know that people are influenced by the choices of those around them, and we know from the work of Danny Ariely and his colleagues and others in his area that the amount of cheating in which human beings are willing to engage depends on the structure of our daily environment. So the peer culture affects our choices, and the structure of our environment affects our choices. And those are things that I think we are not thinking about explicitly enough. If you think about the academic environment, there's some elements of it that might give us pause in the way that we operate and some of the messages, perhaps unintended messages, that we send. We have a star system in academia. We have it for a reason. We have it because, by and large, we believe, and there's some evidence to suggest, that having a star in our midst helps us support the mission. You get more resources, you get better students, you get better visibility, you get better access. All kinds of things the star system is very powerful for. And the problem is that when we do not consider how the star system is implemented or operating, undercuts the institutional mission. And unfortunately, frequently, excuse me, the kind of problems I end up dealing with stem from that. We have talked around the edges about academic rewards and incentives, and I think it's time to have that conversation much more explicitly. We have it in corners and in hallways, and every now and then somebody talks about it, and we talk about how do we fix it. We're not very serious about fixing it because it serves us well, and I think it's time to start doing a better job there. I think it's time to acknowledge and talk much more about the fact that we have a lot of gray areas in our norms, a lot of gray areas in our norms. I have personally presided over proceedings in which we have revoked the degree of students that when the exact same allegation surfaces against a faculty member, our response is, oh, because there's an identification, and there but for the grace of God go I, and what if, and these are complicated, hard things, and we need to talk about it. And we have deeply flawed problem reception and resolution systems, and I recognize that that's a gross generalization, and I think that it's more true than it ought to be. So too many of our research environments send mixed messages, focus almost exclusively on results, not process. We have too many bad examples. Mentoring is very uneven. We have abuses of power. Problem-solving resources are not as ubiquitous as they ought to be. There is an unfortunate amount of suppression of concerns and retaliation, and sometimes it's just self-suppression, right? So these things we have to think about, and it's our job, if we're responsible for the environment, to think about how do we counteract them, because some of them are simply natural when groups of human beings assemble in common cause and end up with a hierarchy and systems and rules and procedures. We just simply have to step back now and then and think about how do we improve what we're doing, because the size of our system is immense. The difference between, in my own family, I think I didn't say early on, and I probably ought to, that I'm actually a lawyer. I come from a family of scientists. They considered what I do the waste of a perfectly good genetic heritage. They still mostly acknowledge me in public, mostly. But I come from this large family of scientists, and my father, who was 96 when he died a handful of years ago, you talk to him about doing science. When he came up through science, he knew personally all of the people in his field who did the kind of work he did. He went to the same meetings with them very often. He had worked in their labs and worked alongside with them. He knew about their techniques and how they worked and their care. He would say about a colleague of his, oh, he doesn't publish much, but every word is golden. And of another colleague, he said, oh, well, for every one good idea he has, he publishes 10 or 20 papers. Right? Now, I have a brother, I'll leave him unnamed, who's at a very large research institution. He doesn't know the names of all the graduate students in his own department. When he goes to his disciplinary society meetings, there are 10,000 people there. He gets so many journals, he can't even really scan the table of contents of all of them. And the scale of the system has implications for how we interact with each other and how we inculcate norms and standards. Because in a very small, socially interconnected system, you can do effective person-to-person informal mentoring, and you can respond informally when there are problems. You cannot do that effectively when the system is so much larger. And I think that if you go back and look at the Broad and Wade book, Betrayers of the Truth, that talked about recidivism, the recidivism problem where we pass our trash from one institution to another because of how the lawyers give us advice about giving recommendations or not, means that in a system this large, informal systems are simply not as effective. And we have been reluctant and we have continued to flinch in making our systems more effective in dealing with problems. The size of the system has other elements. So Bruce Alberts and his colleagues have been writing about the systemic flaws in the system. Again, in this whole effort to make it better, if we do not talk about the problems, we cannot make them better. So the hyper-competition is an element of it. We reward irresponsibility when we value productivity over quality. Our responsible conduct of research is generally a low priority in status and funding. I can't tell you the number of times I go someplace and I'm the ethical event of the semester, and the faculty member responsible says, oh, yeah, I drew the short straw this semester. Or I have gone places to have people say, hey, how would you like to take over our RCR course? And I say, I live 3,000 miles away from you. Well, yeah, we could work it out. Our responsible research training is too compliance-focused, it's poorly trained, and it's often deeply ineffective. And we often are actually inculcating cynicism, not actually teaching responsible research. And the culture is not always tended. I work with units that have a magnificent culture. There's a department that I have knowledge of and interact with pretty regularly in research ethics because they do just a superlative job, where their culture is not only that every single person is involved in teaching, Nobel laureate, not a Nobel laureate, involved in teaching the introductory courses, and everybody is assessed regularly on the quality of their mentoring and how their students are faring. And they're really top-notch researchers. It is possible. One of the things that it's worth bearing in mind is there's a paper in the management literature called On the Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B. It's a lovely paper, a lovely, lovely paper, and I recommend it to you. There's an afterword that was written later after it became a classic paper that said, this almost wasn't published because the editor thought it was too stupid sounding. And Kerr, in this paper, points out that reward systems are fouled up in that the types of behavior rewarded are those in which the rewarder is trying to discourage while the behavior desired is not being rewarded at all. And he talks about how we talk about importance of teamwork while we actually reward individual scoring in baskets or bases. He talks about how we value long-term building profit and what we reward is short-term quarterly profits. So it's worth thinking about what are we rewarding and what do we seek as opposed to not seeking, because I will tell you the entire secret of all the work that I do with really dysfunctional academic units is stop rewarding bad behavior. The very first step is always stop rewarding bad behavior, because I promise you that if you're rewarding bad behavior in your environment, you are soon going to have more of it, because even people with PhDs can figure out if you're rewarding that conduct, they say, ooh, I can do that if that's what it takes to get ahead. It's really important that we think about this. And if you look at the simulation that Smaldino and McElraith have done, they have done these simulation work, and it's only simulation work, and it's only a theoretical paper, and yet they talk about the persistence of poor methods results partly from incentives that favor them, leading to the natural selection of bad science. And in particular, what they're talking about is if the only thing that really matters for advancing is how many papers you publish, you're going to get people who publish a lot of papers. And it's not always a metric of quality, and we care about quality because that's where the progress comes from. So if you pull back and bring all these factors together for a broader view, think about the career arc of a scientist where the challenges start early. Students start in a lab, they learn this is how things are done, and they develop a mental model of research. Students are unbelievably dependent on their advisor and their funding, and all too often their visas, and reluctant to change even when word of mouth or other experience, like, oh hello, some RCR training, suggests the practice is inappropriate. And so this is where the career tragedies come into play. So think about a young scientist, because we can always justify improper actions to ourselves, whether that's eating one more cookie because it's broken and we're standing up and that doesn't count anyway, or something more consequential. So think about a graduate student about to submit a paper for publication that will determine job prospects. There's experiments to complete, there's a limited amount of time to repeat and iterate, the student believes the work is good and important, and the data almost tell the best story, almost. And so you have rationalization, you have temptation, you have ambition, you have a sense of entitlement, because if you ask students, they will say to you, I work so hard, I deserve this. My entire life is consumed by this, and they're not nice to me. I'm entitled. And then you stud in with incrementalism and deception, and maybe we have a stupid system in some ways. So the tragedies all interface and reinforce each other and build together. And students are even less likely to change if the observed practices are winning, whatever that means in our system. And I'll bet you that we all know what it means to win in our system. Loss aversion is really important to think about, because in loss aversion, that Tversky and Kahneman talked about and won their prize for, is that losses loom larger than gains. People are willing to take risks depending on whether they're gain or loss averse. And a prevention focus, which grows out of loss aversion, means that people will take more risks to avoid losses. So now think about a mid-career faculty member. Think about the mindset with people to support, grants to secure, a promotion to full professor to go, and the papers required to do it all. Now we're not taking risks to get something. We're not taking the kind of flashy risks that you often see in the misconduct cases involving young graduate students and postdocs, where they're actually fabricating something or really doing something out there. Now you're talking about people who are more nuanced, more attuned to how the system works, who have way too much to lose if they can't get that next grant or get the next paper published. And the kinds of things that people take, the risks to avoid losing that status and stature, and the lab and the people, are different than you see earlier, and these factors of your prevention focus for being willing to take risks to avoid losses only intensify. And the kinds of conduct change and become much more sophisticated. So we see a lot of findings against graduate students and postdocs for pretty egregious acts. I have seen misconduct in more senior people, and it's much more subtle, and it's much more likely to be explained away or backed away from. So I hope that I've persuaded you that the context indeed has an effect on individuals and that we have some thinking to do about our environments, which brings me to my recommendations. The very first one of which is we need to be a little more scientific about our own practices. We need to assess and benchmark our own research integrity environments. This is not something that I'm just on my hobby horse all by myself tilting at windmills. The Institute of Medicine said in 2002, to promote responsible research conduct and foster integrity, institutions should establish and continuously measure their structures, processes, policies, and procedures, evaluate the institutional environment supporting integrity in the conduct of research, and use this knowledge for ongoing improvement. There is an instrument out there called the Survey of Organizational Research Climate, developed by Carol Thrush and extended with Brian Martinson, Jim Wells, and some other colleagues, that's statistically validated with a very large sample, shows correlations between choices and the quality, the integrity of the research environment, and provides benchmarking through two-stage reporting, both campus and anonymized comparison database. Our Ethics Center has invested with Brian and Carol in creating an online engine to deliver the survey, to quantify the results, to create a report engine, so that one of the things that happens when you administer this survey across a campus is that you will find departments, and it has 7 scales, and you can measure them on each scale. You get readings on each scale, and you get readings for a unit, assuming that there are more than 5 respondents in each category for graduate students, postdocs, research staff, faculty. So you get these results, and one of the things that commonly happens when you sit with the department head and are talking about what does it show about your quality in your department, they say, well, all the departments in my field are this way because of the pressures of our field. It's different than those other fields. And the thing about an institutional comparison database is that if you have a database that shows what other peer institutions are and have results from them, you can say, well, actually, these departments of widgetology and all these other R1 institutions, their scores are here and yours are here. So what do you think the difference might be? So benchmarking power comes from the competitive instincts of human beings. The purpose of a benchmarking database is to harness that to improve, so that we're actually saying the integrity of our environment is really high. It's a distinguishing positive characteristic. So we do automated data collection through emailed surveys, and you can assess efforts over time, and we provide this service because measuring and assessing the integrity of research climates is really important. We have focused on the source because it is the only validated instrument out there right now. If there are other instruments, we would be working with those as well. Because one of the things that we know is that the way change happens, if you study change management, one of the most powerful ways to influence and affect change is to find the bright spots where things are already working really well, figure out what's working, and try to spread more of it. And if you have information, it gives leadership power for shaping the environments in positive ways, improving ways. So I detected a pattern in the first 2 days that somehow every so often somebody had to show an article by Monia Baker. So I stuck one in here last night because I didn't want to be not one of the cool kids. So here's a Monia Baker article about this, just so that I'm one of the cool kids too. And it really ties us and makes this point that if you have data about where the environments are strong and not strong, you can improve how you deliver effective and realistic responsible conduct of research education. And I really want to stress, we are educational institutions. We believe in the power of education to change norms. The American system of higher education is unique in the universe in believing that anybody, anywhere, excuse me, I got a little carried away there, I'm excited by this concept, anybody can get access to an education and change their place in society. And yes, it's a lot harder now than it used to be. My first semester in college, I paid $232 for my tuition for my public higher education. And it's harder to get access these days, and yet it's still possible to change your place through education. We believe in the transformative power of education. So why are we doing such a poor job of inculcating professionals' norms and standards into our emerging professionals? Because by some estimates, and this has been an informal survey that Mike Kalichman from UCSD did, institutions with large research budgets devote less than 0.1% of their research funding to RCR. The Genomics Initiative is devoting 3% of its funding to ethical, social, and legal implications. That's way high in this tight environment. I'm just saying, if we aspired and hit 0.1%, that would be an improvement, folks. Unfortunately, virtually all of our RCR is delivered through multiple choice online programs. One survey has it at almost 90%. I was going to bring a question from one of those surveys. I signed on and did. One of my institutions provided multiple choice online research ethics training on the weekend because I thought that I would just screen capture a question and bring it. I couldn't do that because I had to sign a certification that I wouldn't screen capture or share any of the questions to preserve the integrity of my research, my responsible conduct training. This training is by and large definitional and reading comprehension. What does paragraph 14.3c in the Belmont report say? I made that up. That's not an actual question. That would have been cheating. And we do this for a reason, is because if there's a requirement that you deliver RCR to everyone, you need to be able to scale it, because some of our places are pretty big, and you need to be able to document that you did it. A really effective way to document that you've delivered it and deliver it at scale is through some online training. The unfortunate consequence is that none of it's effective, but we've documented it, and everybody's done it, and all too often we have inculcated really serious cynicism by the message we send about, oh yeah, that's something you can do online, and you don't even really have to read the material to pass it. Just go and do it. It's a compliance obligation. And unfortunately, even that isn't reliably done. The National Science Foundation has done a survey, and they're talking at meetings about their results, and they're finding even when they ask places for documentation that it's done, a lot of them don't have it. And this focus on rules and compliance versus real problems encountered in research is really detrimental to our mission. It's really undercutting us in some important ways. And part of my message is that one-size-fits-all multiple-choice compliance training is not RCR. And we ought to stop talking like it is, because it is not. If we train people what the rules are for dealing with human subjects or animal subjects or lab safety, or what is the definition of fabrication, it doesn't answer any of the questions that actual students, postdocs, junior faculty, people facing dilemmas have. What are the real world research needs I encounter? Well, people need professional skills, how to present their research, how to mentor effectively, how to support diversity. What are good laboratory practices in my field, in my discipline, doing my kind of work? I talked with a graduate student who said, when I was doing my graduate rotation, my lab rotation, I would go in and they would say, do an assay, and what I would discover is it was like walking into a place and getting a recipe that included only a list of ingredients. Didn't have quantities, didn't have times, didn't have order of mixing, didn't have how long to cook it. because every single person in the lab did their assay differently. There was no standard protocol. What are good lab practices? I've talked with groups of students who said, you know, they say that we have to do a good job with keeping lab data, but nobody ever talked to us about how to keep notebooks. And what do I do with all my computer-generated output? I just back it up and dump it. How to have a dispute professionally. It turns out that if you work in a system infested with other human beings, it is really important to know how to have a dispute professionally, particularly if that person has more power than you do. And there are rules. There are unwritten rules, although I wrote some of them down in an article that turns out, I wrote an article a zillion years ago called How to Blow the Whistle and Still Have a Career Afterwards. Turns out to be the most cited article I ever wrote. And I wrote it sort of one afternoon, sort of. There are some rules, we should know them. We need to talk to people about the fact that you are going to have disagreements with people. Who should be first author? Who should be second author? Whose idea was it? How did we get here? Does this person belong on the paper or not? I need you to leave the lab. No, you're not getting the fellowship. We don't talk to people about how to maneuver in the trenches for getting credit and giving it versus the formal rules of authorship, because how it's walked is quite differently than how it's talked. And we need to just talk about the real rules. How to choose a mentor and colleagues for character. I say to audiences of graduate students, how many of you spend more of your waking hours at work than you do with family and friends? Let me just ask you, how many people here spend more of your waking hours at work than you do with family and friends? It's about a standard number. And that's an interesting thing to ponder, because if you are going to spend more of your waking hours at work, the quality of the character of those people, their integrity, their honor, and how they make choices will shape and influence yours. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates that you will become more like the people you work with. And so don't you think that we should talk to people about how much the character of the people you work with shapes your own, and get people to think about that at the front end? Because I say to students, how did you choose? Well, the lab has a lot of papers. Okay, cool. If you're choosing between a lab that puts out, 100 papers a year, as opposed to a lab that puts out 10 papers a year, how are you choosing? Ooh, I'd go to the lab with 100 papers. And I say, okay, I get that. That's really a productive lab. They're putting out a lot of work. Who do you think you're going to be working with and getting trained by in a lab that puts out 100 papers a year? Are you going to see the great man or the great woman very often? Worth thinking about. What kind of training are you actually going to get, and who's going to be providing it, and what are you going to be learning, and what are you going to be passing along? We don't actually talk about, particularly in this day and age of technology, the line between making your data look pretty and manipulating and altering data and images. Why don't we do that? We spend a lot of time doing after examination of images that have been manipulated. Why don't we just talk openly about this in the first instance? How about talking turkey about finding the line between inappropriate self-promotion and advancing your career sensibly? Have you ever gone to that talk where the person spends the entire talk name-dropping and telling you how many important people think they're really swell? And how much did it turn you off, as opposed to the talk where somebody walked in and told you what they'd done and had confidence in it and was ready to answer every question, and who were you more impressed by? This is like a novel question sometimes for students who sometimes think that you have to tell it, particularly if you're at the low end of the power curve, you don't know how to do it well. And we don't tell people how to get useful advice and recognize it when you encounter a problem. I hear from a lot of students who are dealing with pretty serious problems, and I say to them, who did you talk to before you talked to me? Virtually all of them say, well, I called my mom. And I say, I'm a mother. I think that's a really good idea. Call your mom, because, if you're doing something that you would be embarrassed to tell your mom or your grandmother, I think that's a problem. Who else did you get advice from? I didn't know where to go. Shame on us, folks. We got to be doing better than this. So what should it be? Quality, responsible conduct of research, education, not training, should be relevant to the audience, required for all. I can't tell you how many places I go and the students look around and they say, how come it's only students here? The problems are those guys. I say, because they can require you? Interactive, experiential, and using best practices. Hello, there's actually some work done that shows what's effective in ethics education or not. Mike Mumford at Oklahoma has done some really lovely work on what's the difference between quality and how do people absorb ethics education and not. Meaningful and related to the work being done. How many of you have had to take some online compliance training that had nothing to do with the kind of research you do? And how did you feel about that use of your time, the irreplaceable resource? And how did you feel about the requirement that you do it? Do you feel more responsible now as a researcher? Are you doing better work now? More rigorous? More integrity? Likely reproducible? Has to be delivered at part, at least by respected researchers. I think Jeff Flyer pointed out that people look more to what the, in every environment there's a formal curriculum and an informal curriculum. And the formal curriculum is what we stand up and blah, blah, blah about, and the informal curriculum is what everybody is doing. What's your informal curriculum teaching? And if your respected researchers don't show up to the research ethics events and aren't teaching some of them, you're sending a message. And, I go places and when people say, how about if you take care of our research ethics stuff for us? One of the things that I say, because they say, I'm really not qualified to teach ethics. And I say, I get that. And they say, I don't know anything about deontology. I say, okay, I get that. And have you ever had an authorship dispute over the course of your career? Oh, sure. Could you talk about it and the lessons you learned and what you did well and what you didn't well? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Have you ever had a problem getting somebody to share materials that you needed? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Could you talk about that with students? Sure. Have you ever oh, yeah, you bet. I say, if you could just go in and talk about learning points in your career where you learned how to do something well or not well, and what you learned from that for being a better scientist, that would be really important RCR education. And we don't assess it very often. We actually know that the online multiple choice training is not effective, and yet we persist in it because why? Oh yeah, it's documentable and scalable. So to my third recommendation in thinking about that barrel, I'd like to point out that there are some factors in our environment that go from institutional leadership and structures, reward systems, which we've all talked about, and conflicts of interest. In corporations, when they do ethics programs, and there are corporations that really care about this and have done a lot of work on it and have tens of thousands of new employees a year they have to inculcate into the system, they talk about tone at the top, mood in the middle, and buzz at the base. And they have differentiated education at each of those levels, and they do it regularly because it matters. So one of the questions I want to know is, why don't we hold leadership accountable when the culture doesn't support rigor in an institution or investigations are botched? Because all too often, as we have seen unfortunately this week, at least the perception is that institutions circle the wagon when there's a problem because we ask the wrong questions too often. How will this affect our reputation if it gets out? How could anyone think Bill would do such a thing? How can we make this go away? We don't have to report this, do we? Why would you want to cause trouble for your own research project? These are all real questions I've heard discussed. And there's another answer for this out of social psychology, which is about moral hypocrisy and group identification and evaluation. And it was nicely translated into the New York Times recently about why do fans excuse the Patriots' cheating past. It's because of identification and group identity. So if you look at the National Science Foundation, they have a list of all the things that they see poorly in investigation reports, from not interviewing people to half-page investigation report to failure to interview key witnesses. I review a fair number of institutional reports, and I see investigation shortcomings across the waterfront here. Inadequate reports, missing elements. I see reports that go like this. Well, he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. But it's not misconduct because he said he didn't mean to, and we couldn't say, so he didn't have intent. Now, as a lawyer, I can tell you there are actually ways of inferring intent, and that's not it. We need to do better. So here's an example that I find particularly unfortunate. We're pleased with the findings of the research misconduct. We trust that this will serve to fully absolve the clinicians and researchers who were unwittingly associated with his actions. This is trending to the bad apple narrative. And yet, in this bad apple narrative, in the deposition of one of the research supervisors, it said, once you started digging, how long did it take you to find the manipulations? Well, it would take you maybe an hour. 64 co-authors, 11 retractions so far, 3 clinical trials, 117 patients. And yet this was all one bad apple? Really? And I took out the names because I'm not trying to beat up on anyone in particular, but this is a persistent problem. And so what are better questions? Do we want our name and institution, reputations associated with the institution where dishonest work is countenanced? Are there other scholars depending on this work? What kind of education are our students getting? I believe we must peer review institutional responses to allegations of misconduct. I think we just have to do this. If we believe peer review is good, I think we have to do it. I am out of time. I am going to finish here. I'm going to say, in terms of institutional reward structures, one of the changes that I have seen over my career is the move to have faculty members support their own salary out of their grants. And I think it's caused tremendous damage. So I will end by saying the argument that science must be regulating itself pretty well because it's making its progress is far from compelling. Perhaps progress would be twice or 4 times as fast with greater scrupulosity. Paul Friedman, he's a research integrity lion. So let's ask more questions. Why aren't we using an empirical approach? Why aren't we assessing our environments? Why aren't we using the results to improve? Why is doing RCR well such a low priority? Why are only students required? Why aren't professional and real-world skills included? Why aren't we reforming perverse incentives? Why aren't institutional leaders queried about the integrity of their environments? Why aren't investigation reports peer-reviewed? Why aren't leaders who preside over research botched investigations held accountable for the tone there? So let's get serious, and let's recognize that it's past time to acknowledge and adapt. Thank you.